There's no doubting that the NFL is the unrivaled king of television. Its iron-fisted reign has lasted for over half a century. The league's viewing stats are astonishing. 18 of the 24 most watched broadcasts in American history are Super Bowls. Only the Apollo moon landing has bested them. Last year, over 100 million people tuned in to watch a lackluster Super Bowl.
That might have been the worst Super Bowl in my life.
Even meaningless preseason games are moderate spectacles. 2018's exhibition slate averaged 2.35 million viewers per game, heavily outdrawing network TV shows that air in the same time slot. In fact, according to Nielsen, the 4 highest rated television events of 2018 were NFL games. Number 5, This Is Us. Then, more football. And yet, the NFL wasn't always a giant of the medium. Its beginnings were humble. The NFL started squarely at the bottom and faced immense challenges and massive failures along the way. In this 2-part series, you will see the NFL ascend to the top of our airwaves, watch it destroy all adversaries, innovate where others failed, rule atop its throne with an iron fist, then ask, what could possibly take this monolith down? The NFL's Rise to Power Part 1 is coming up next. The NFL's inaugural season took place in 1920, a full 3 decades before television would find its way into most American households. Not only was the NFL second fiddle to baseball, which was truly America's pastime in the early 20th century, but it was actually considered an inferior product to college football, which had recently become much safer and far more entertaining after Teddy Roosevelt personally demanded the institution of the forward pass in 1906. The National Football League, which until 1922 was called the American Professional Football Association, was little more than a handshake agreement between 4 teams: the Rock Island Independents, the Dayton Triangles, the Canton Bulldogs, and the Cleveland Indians. It was not an overnight success, to say the least. Into the 30s, the pros still lagged behind college in competing sports like baseball and even boxing. However, things began to trend upwards when in 1934, the first NFL game, a Thanksgiving matchup between the Bears and the Lions, was broadcast on NBC radio. While the game gave rise to its first few stars in the decade with Red Grange, Bronco Nagurski, and Green Bay's Don Hudson, football was still not a particularly lucrative industry. In 1936, when the NFL held its first amateur draft, number 1 overall pick Jay Berwanger turned down the NFL for a job at a Chicago rubber company because the Bears couldn't meet his salary demands, $1,000 per game. Despite spurning the league, a move he later regretted, the NFL rebounded, and in 1939 they achieved a media milestone. When the Brooklyn Dodgers played the Philadelphia Eagles in Ebbets Field on October 22, 1939, less than 2 months after the declaration of war in Europe, an NBC crew of 8 men and 2 cameras broadcast Brooklyn's 23-14 victory to roughly 1,000 television sets in New York. That same year, the NFL would eclipse 1 million in attendance for the season, setting up a certain boom in the near future. Of course, that was all put on hold when the United States entered World War II in 1941. 638 players left to join the armed forces, and football, while still active, was secondary for the first half of the decade. In the 1943 season, the Steelers and the Eagles were so short on men that they were allowed to consolidate and become the Steagles, leading to a similar merger between the Cardinals and the Steelers the next season. Just when things were getting started for the NFL, they were met with serious obstacles, like global warfare. The war ended just prior to the start of the 1945 season, and out of the 638 that left to fight, 21 players had died in combat. For the remainder of the 40s, the game picked up right where it left off, and in the post-war boom, started to become a viable television product. NFL football on the small screen was less a novelty and more of a staple as television sets began creeping into the average American home. When the Eagles and Cardinals faced off in the 1948 title game, it became the first broadcasted championship in the sport's history, treating American viewers to a 7-0 Eagles win. In 1950, the Los Angeles Rams and the Washington Redskins became the first 2 teams to have all of their games, both home and away, broadcast on TV. 1 year later, the Dumont Network, a rival of CBS and NBC, paid $75,000 to televise the NFL championship game. Despite broadcasting the first live coast-to-coast NFL games in 1953 and lasting 3 seasons, the NFL wanted more and took their business back to NBC, whose 120 local affiliates was far more appealing than the paltry 18 that Dumont provided. Even with the rapid growth that the NFL experienced through the start of the 50s, a decade that saw 55 million TV sets introduced to living rooms across the country, there was still one giant yet to be slayed: baseball. The MLB had not loosened its grip on the national consciousness. Sports fans were still enthralled by players like Willie Mays, Jackie Robinson, Ted Williams, Ernie Banks, and Mickey Mantle. Baseball had an established foothold with Americans. It had a history, a clear narrative, and perhaps more importantly, it had stars. That was to change on December 28, 1958, when 64,000 plus gathered into Yankee Stadium to watch the Baltimore Colts play the New York Giants. NBC sent their cameras, crew, and announcers to broadcast the game across a nation eager to sit at home and turn on their TV sets during a particularly cold winter night. The game itself, unlike previously televised championships, was a thrilling affair between two teams that contained 17 future Hall of Famers. Johnny Unitas passed for 349 yards, 187 which went to Raymond Berry, while on the other side, future television star Frank Gifford added 75 yards and a touchdown for New York. With the Colts trailing 17-14 near the end of regulation, Unitas used his patented 2-minute drill to work the Colts into field goal range, culminating in a 20-yarder from kicker Steve Mira. The Colts had tied the game, setting up sudden death overtime, and more focused eyeballs on the game. As the extra period began, the Giants went 3 and out and punted back to the Colts, who drove from the 20-yard line all the way to New York's 8. Then the feed cut out and the TVs went dark. At that point, a fan ran onto the field and delayed the game for a few minutes. This gave them enough time to repair the problem and restore the broadcast. Many believe it wasn't a fan but an NBC employee who ran onto the field to buy them a couple minutes to replug a loose signal cable. Sounds familiar, eh? A short slant to Berry and the Colts were at the goal line. A quick dive and Alan Amici burst into the end zone, giving the Colts a sudden death victory, an NFL championship, and the league the marquee moment that they thirsted for. 45 million Americans watched what was later called the greatest game ever played. It had birthed stars in Unitas, Berry, and Gifford, formidable enough to rival players like Mays, Mantle, and Robinson. The NFL had leveled its first blow against baseball, and they had done it in its most famous venue, though this unrivaled achievement wouldn't last for long. The game was such a success, in fact, that it convinced a Texas billionaire named Lamar Hunt to start a rival league in 1960 called the American Football League. The NFL finally had a direct competitor, but as you will see, it doesn't always end well for its adversaries. Hunt's AFL inked a 5-year deal with ABC and hit the ground running with 8 new franchises: the Oakland Raiders, LA Chargers, Denver Broncos, Dallas Texans, Houston Oilers, Miami Dolphins, Boston Patriots, and New York Titans. From the first whistle, the AFL proved it was a product tailor-made for television. It innovated the game and adopted moving cameras to follow the ball, mics on the field, and nameplates on the backs of jerseys to help fans identify players. Their uniforms were colorful, like the Broncos orange, the Dolphins aqua, and the Chargers powder blue. Most importantly, the AFL style of play was better suited for audience that craved excitement and action. It had gunslingers like John Hadle, Darryl LaMonica, and Len Dawson, who made the deep ball a viable alternative to the NFL's 3 yards and a cloud of dust offenses. Games were pass-happy and high-scoring, resulting in thrillers like the Texas Oilers double overtime barn burner in the 1962 AFL Championship. The AFL wasn't just after the eyeballs on the TV. They wanted more, and in a huge attack, they went after what they knew would sound the alarms at the mothership: talent. The New York Jets, formerly the Titans, drafted Alabama quarterback Joe Namath in 1965. More players flocked to the AFL as the NFL sat worried about their future from the heat they were feeling from this unwanted competitor. Bidding wars over talent started. They knew something had to be done, and their solution turned into the very thing that would fuel the NFL to the next level, and what would be the sword they would wield against all of television. Talks of an AFL-NFL merger began in 1966, and though the two sides were miles apart, the two leagues put down their shields to work together. They formed a compromise, the AFL-NFL Championship. The first such game, which would retroactively be called Super Bowl I, featured the Kansas City Chiefs, the AFL champs, and the juggernaut Green Bay Packers, coached by Vince Lombardi. Because NBC broadcast the AFL and CBS broadcast the NFL at the time, they both agreed to air the first meeting of the two leagues. The networks charged $42,000 for a 30-second ad during the game. It would be the first and only time the Super Bowl was simulcast on two different networks, with the aforementioned Frank Gifford manning the booth for the NBC squad. Lombardi's Packers were heavy favorites, and they showed why, scoring 21 answered points in the second half to win 35-10. 61,000 fans attended the game at the LA Coliseum, while another 50 million tuned in on either NBC or CBS to watch the NFL flex its muscles over its supposed little brother. Though the game was not impressive, it was a resounding television success. However, both the NFL and AFL still firmly trailed baseball in TV ratings. But as the two leagues bask in the glory of their collaborative event, the friendly rivalry was not to last. Oh no, things were about to get ugly. Coming up on part 2, the NFL continues its trend of mercilessly defeating competitors, innovating and stealing from others, and bursts a modern era of television dominance the USA has never seen. I'm 5 Points Vids, and you made it to my next video.